You are listening to The Bell Post. Welcome to our next episode of our podcast. And today we're going to be talking about a topic we don't talk about enough. And that is how these bad reform or bail reform failures are having a significant impact on domestic violence survivors. And I think legislators and judges would be shocked about how these bail reform failures are impacting this group in such a negative way. And today we have a guest, and she is a host of her own podcast. It's called Let's Break the Silence with Angeline Mitchell. Thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for having me on your show today. Honored to be here, Ken. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show because I think this is an issue that kind of is under the radar.
It
Um,
is under the radar, yes.
but let's talk about let's set this up. So, you're a domestic violence survivor as well, and that's what kind of brought you into this area of interest. It's not, I guess we would say it wasn't willingly, but uh, you share your story on your podcast of healing from a relationship of domestic violence and the critical moment that where you drew a line in the sand and you decided that you deserved more in your life. Let's begin with, what red flags did you have, or did you have any red flags at the start of your relationship, and what do you think changed that caused this relationship to become more toxic?
That's a good question. And when I was first in the relationship, which then led to marriage, there were no signs whatsoever
Hmm.
because he masked it, meaning he wore the mask and didn't display any erratic behavior, narcissistic behavior, gaslighting, nothing. He was, I thought he was the love of my life, honestly. I
Wow.
mean, being married at 25 and
Hmm.
working in New York City and making six-figure income, that was like the dream
Oh,
because I moved to
absolutely.
Minnesota. Yeah. So I said, and then, but slowly but surely, he started to show it. And we got married in 1989 as the Justice of the Peace. And he was not shortly after, but like after about a year or two, then he started to show narcissistic behavior, meaning he would gaslight me, he would ignore me, he would blame me for the finances. Meanwhile, I worked in his business and brought sales in for the company. We were selling advertising in New York City and the five boroughs. So I was out on the road all the time. I was getting sales for him, and he didn't feel appreciative.
Do you think he was always like this, or do you think it became you were outshining him, or do you think something happened in his personal life? Because people change over time. What do you think was the cause of him stopping masking?
A couple of things happened. He became jealous and resentful
Hmm.
because all of a sudden I was shining. And also, he and back in childhood, I remember he shared this story with me of his mom. This is when he was about
Hmm.
5 years of age, and he was brought up in a Greek family like me. And his mom, he was in the bedroom doing something, and his mom threw a shoe at him. And I think that was, something that was ingrained in his mind because that's like trauma. It's traumatic for a 5-year-old to experience that. And he never expressed it until much later.
Well,
Never
so
said anything.
so
Yeah.
you're
So,
working in his business. Y'all are very integrated, and
mhm.
you start seeing red flags. How long did it take for you to decide, you know what, I'm drawing a line in the sand. This has got to stop.
Well, it took me a long time, and I'll tell you
Mhm.
why, because I felt ashamed. And I felt ashamed to come out and share my story and to seek help at first. Later on, I did seek help, but at first, I did not seek help because it was I felt embarrassed. It was my self esteem was like way down, and I remember in 1999 in December. And I've shared this on my podcast along with other um, podcast shows. He One night there was an argument, and I was lying in bed, I was crying, and I was wearing my robe, and I said, "Well, you know what? I'll just go into the other room and just sleep tonight," because we lived in a 3-bedroom Cape house, and I didn't make it into the other room. He
Mm,
took me from behind, he grabbed me by the neck, and he threw me against the wall near the bathroom, and I fell backwards. And I was bleeding. My nose was broken.
wow.
Yeah, yeah, and that was very traumatic for me because I was like, now, yeah, I'm I'm lying down. I mean, I'm basically crying, and I'm wondering whether I'm gonna make it that night
Yeah.
because I was bleeding. And what's not unusual is that he 5 minutes later took me to the hospital, to the emergency room, which is not unusual because he was trying to cover it up and make it seem that I fell down the stairs. And so he took me to the emergency room. I was there all night, hooked up on IV, and the surgeon came out and he said, "You're going to need reconstructive nose surgery." So I was all bandaged up, but I was in pain. Like my face was swollen, everything was swollen.
So when
My
you
face.
decide, okay, we've crossed the line and now you're showing me a side of yourself that
Mm.
I not only am I don't like, it's not the person I thought I knew. Now I'm scared. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
how do you go from I mean, I understand what you're saying about, you have all these feelings about, you're ashamed. I mean, I know a lot of people, I would feel it's partly my fault. This person isn't the person I thought it was my fault. But how do you go from there to saying, okay, I'm done? I mean, I would have so much fear that, there's going to be so much retribution. I mean, financial, physical, all
Oh
the
yeah.
spectrum.
There was financial abuse, there was verbal abuse. After that incident happened, he never hit me again. It was just a lot of verbal abuse. Like things would be okay for a couple of weeks and then he would be back at it. So I drew a line in the sand in May of 2010. And I said, I just woke up one morning with an epiphany. I call it an awakening. So the awakening was that I surrendered and I stopped playing the victim, and I decided to drive to my lawyer's office at that time in Poughkeepsie, New York, and write out a check for $5,000 to start divorce proceedings. And that was like the turning point for me. So that was like the pivoting moment for me where I just said, that's it. That's it. Because I had gone for counseling, I went for
Sure.
therapy, and I started to go out by myself, and I realized that I could live on my own. I said, I can do this. It was a mindset shift for me.
I have a special needs daughter who's, when she
Mhm.
was 5, she had a bone marrow transplant. Now she's a freshman in college.
Right.
And when she was very, so she has some arm deficiencies because she's missing one of the 2 bones in both of her forearms. And she had a bone marrow transplant because she had low platelets. When she was very young, I mean, when she was like kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade, people would say things to her about her arms. And I mean, she was such a champion for herself. She would say, "Hey, that's not nice. You're not supposed to talk to people like that." And, sometime at some point through the years, that changed and she became a much more shy person, a loner. And I wish wouldn't we all be much healthier if we were like when she was real little and when something like that happened, say, "Hey, you're not supposed to do that. That's not
Right.
nice. That's not the proper way we're supposed to talk to people." But I think what she went through as she went through high school is really what a lot of people go through. They get beat down.
Mm, they do. They do. They get beaten down. Correct. Yes, absolutely.
Well,
And
talk
this, yeah,
talk
go.
about when once you decide, okay, this is a toxic relationship, we're going to end it. From
Hmm.
that decision to what I would say rebuilding your life or making a new life. What
Right.
was that like? How long did it take?
It took me a year to rebuild my life.
Mhm.
And what I did was I sought coaching and mentorship. And I also became involved in the online space on Facebook because I knew that there was support there. So I sought support right
Mhm.
away. Um, there's
Talk about how important that support is.
very important. That's vital. That is vital. There are plenty of support groups out there, and I've, done a lot. And I went to the local library. I did my research, and I joined support groups virtually and, in person, meaning, I joined a book club, and I joined organization, I joined and got involved that, with some organizations, and, like book clubs,
Mhm.
became more involved in the church. Um, so I could rebuild my life and seek support because there was too much suffering going on. And, there's a lot of women who are suffering out there. And that's part of the human condition. And you can only stay in that suffering mode for so long. And I sought support from my family. I mean, I had to borrow the $5,000 to start
Sure.
divorce proceedings, and then I eventually paid it back after a year. But I had to borrow money, and I had to make a plan, an exit plan, because we lived in Rhinebeck, New York, which is 2 hours north of New York City. So I made a plan to move up here to Saratoga Springs. So I did some research. I would, go to the library, and I remember driving up here in Saratoga, and I attended a women's event because I'm very passionate about,
Mhm.
helping women. So I attended a conference for the weekend. It was Friday and Saturday.
Mhm.
I was like, wow. And I fell in love with the area. So when we were close to settlement, then I was looking for an apartment. I sought refuge up here.
Sure.
I would go to, like if they had an arts club here, and I was a member of the arts club, I would go take yoga classes. I became involved, and that changed my life. It just opened up a whole new world for me. So a year later, because I surrounded myself with mentors and leaders who believed in me, a year later, I was able to reclaim my life back and claim victory from domestic violence and break through, shattering those self-limiting beliefs, because domestic violence survivors, they're being ignored. I mean, I know that there's a lot of resources out there, but basically they're being ignored, especially by the government, by legislatures.
So let's talk about before this
Yeah.
push for what I call bad bail reform or bail reform
Mhm.
failures. Talk about even before that, the difficulties that domestic violence survivors would have in trying to rely upon the criminal justice system to provide them with protection and be their out of the relationship.
Okay, I'll speak from my experience. I went for a protective order.
Mhm.
So right before the papers were served, I went to family court. And I did this all on my own with the support of my family, obviously, but I went to court by myself. I did all the work. So I filed a limited order of protection because I was still at home, but I moved all my stuff upstairs. So I so once I filed the order of protection, then I went to go spend time with my family for 2 weeks. I left town for 2 weeks. And when I came back, I will never forget this. The deputy from the sheriff's office called me. He said, "Before you go home, I want you to meet me here, and I want to have a conversation with you." I said, "Oh, okay." So I presumed it was because the protective order was served.
Mhm.
And so what he told me was this. He said he's going to try to do this to you. He's going to try to charm you. He's going to try and talk you into rescinding the protective order. He said, if you do that, we are not going to help you.
Wow.
And I did not rescind the protective order. So that's so so like for myself, I was smart enough not to rescind the protective order because they warned me what was going to happen. They warned me.
And did what they warned you about, did that actually happen? You know, he did try to talk you into
He
rescinding it?
tried to talk me right. Oh, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be fine. It's the lovey-dovey, the charm because as a businessman, he was very charming, to business people and
Mhm.
we
Sure.
and everything. But even to his family actually saw the light and they actually supported me.
So,
Well,
do is the protective order really the number one tool for domestic violence survivors? I mean,
yes,
it's before we get to all the bad bail reform issues, I
right.
mean, it seems like a protective order is only gonna there's only consequences after they violate it, and the worst violation is if you kill somebody.
That's true. And actually, I had to call the police several times because there was one morning that I remember I was upstairs, I was sleeping, I was actually starting to wake up, and he pounded on the door. I'm like, "Oh no."
Mm.
And I had the phone right next to me. I had the phone right next to me, so I called 911 immediately.
And what
I
were the
called
consequences for his violation of the protective order?
that I had to leave.
Yeah. Mhm.
I
So there
left
were
the
no
house.
consequences for him.
Correct, correct, just like a warning or something.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but basically I had to leave. I was the one who had to leave. So when the
Wow.
state police and sheriff came, I mean, it was like a whole big scene at the house. Um, I had to leave. And I remember one of the police officers actually helped me with put the suitcase in the trunk. And I ended up like for that year, I I was staying in people's homes. I lived like a gypsy for one
Sure.
year because I basically was not home. I would only go home to pick up things and, like go stay at a motel. Like
Mhm.
some of my friends had to actually pay for, my motel stay while I was going through this whole ordeal. But I had to leave. The only time that I didn't have to leave was 2 weeks before I moved out. I went back to the house because I was staying someplace with a friend, and I went to go to the house to get my belongings because I was getting ready to move up here. And he wouldn't let me in. And I called the New York State Police, and one of the deputies came and he actually ordered him to leave for 2 hours
Wow.
so I could get my belongings.
Well, and then
Yeah.
when we add all these bad bail reforms where they're just either catch release or, when there's allegation of domestic violence or they arrest them and then immediately release them on these simple release policies. I mean, that just seems like, okay, we're making this person mad and then sending
Right.
them right back home. Even with a protective order, we've had so many bad results. I mean, I can think of one in Houston where after the release, within a short time, the wife was killed and she was pregnant, and there was a bill filed in the Texas legislature called Caitlin's Law over it. I mean, it seems like these bail reform measures are making it almost impossible for domestic violence survivors to even think about going to law enforcement because they need to spend their time on their getaway plan.
Right, exactly. That's where so much focus is on a getaway plan. And there are shelters, and there's nothing wrong with going to a shelter. I
Mhm.
actually went to one, and I was assigned a caseworker from Battered Women's Services in Poughkeepsie, and they worked on my case for 1 year. So there are shelters throughout the country, whatever state you live in. Um, and I actually helped a couple of women, and here they had children.
Yeah, well, I
I
mean,
didn't
we
have
add children to the element, it just makes it 10 times harder.
oh, it's awful. It's awful. It's awful. And I remember when I was in court one day and there was a couple, it was like a domestic violence, except a child was involved, there was a child
Mhm.
there. The stuff that goes on in court, it's crazy.
Well, if you
Crazy.
had an opportunity like today to talk to a legislator or a judge,
Mm.
about how the government, the criminal justice system is failing domestic violence survivors. What could they be doing differently so that we're not putting the perpetrator over the victim?
Right, exactly. That's the whole problem. This issue is shoved under the carpet. They do not want to talk about it. No one wants to talk about protecting domestic violence survivors or even giving them food, shelter, resources. They would rather spend that money on something else. That is totally, I mean, I'm an advocate for domestic violence. So my goal, one of my goals, and I'm going to be working on this is we have to be that voice. We have a voice, and it's up to us to amplify our voices. It's up to us to call our legislatures instead of focusing. So, for instance, TikTok being banned. Let's go to the legislatures and let's talk about providing resources for domestic and having tougher laws against the
Mhm.
abusers. That's where the legal system is broken.
Well, I've looked at this,
Mm.
as I was preparing for today, and I Texas has amended their constitution to allow domestic violence survivors to be denied bail in the appropriate situation, which that's great. That's a great resource. But the problem is a lot of the charges that they're charged with are misdemeanors. And so judges aren't going to deny bail for a misdemeanor. And a lot of times, like where we're having problems in Houston, they're just being released on a personal bond. And that's where we're having problems. There's no cooling off period. There's
Mhm.
no uh, wait. It's just they're mad. And so they get out of jail and they go do something. And, I think about my home county, Smith County, where we've had the courthouse shot up. It was over family issue. The Fort Worth Court of Appeals years ago had an oral argument and multiple judges got shot during the oral argument. It was a family issue. So these
Wow.
family issues are the lightning rod for violence, and we're not giving them their due. We're actually I agree with what you're saying. We're putting it all under the carpet. We're ignoring it. And in this bail reform movement, where bail reform is failing victims, it is just 10 times worse because now the victim can't even think about going to the criminal justice system because they've got to get out for their own
Right.
protection. And then that makes their ultimate case worse when they're filing for divorce because they haven't made certain allegations. So it makes it harder for them to limit access to the children.
Exactly. Exactly. And not only that, and that's true. We're so focused on making an exit plan.
Hmm.
And what about the abuser? Like for instance, for me, I called the police numerous times. Why not just take
Yes.
him away?
Why
He
not?
violated the protective order. Nope, they did nothing.
I was looking at this. I'm like, well, there's a high
Yeah.
dismissal rate on these types of charges for domestic
Oh
violence.
yes.
Well, absolutely there is. The witness or the complainant is going into hiding or they're scared for their safety. And so absolutely there's going to be a high dismissal rate because they're worried about their skin, not about, if the
Mhm.
government's not going to protect them, if the government's not willing to spend the resources to uh, ensure their safety, then what else would you expect the result to be?
Exactly. Exactly. Now, for example, I have a very good friend who lives in Missouri, and last year she almost died. Her abuser nearly choked her to death. And she called the police. He has an alcohol problem, so he
Mhm.
has all kinds of issues. So make a long story short, he went to jail. And guess what she told me 2 weeks ago? That
What?
he was out early. So now she's making a plan to move out of state.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she has to for her own safety.
Yeah, exactly. And she has a daughter.
Mm.
But I mean, she's afraid, like she said one night, I hope he doesn't come to the house. I mean, this is why are they being set free? It makes no sense to me when he literally almost murdered her and he gets out and He's
Well, he got
now
out because he didn't murder her. If he'd have murdered her, he would have gotten a longer sentence. I mean, that's really where we
right,
are.
right.
I
That's
mean,
unfortunately that's the case, and that has to change. So it's up to us to, go for
yeah,
me, go to Albany, New York, and be the voice for women. Bond with, like band together. That's what I call it.
sure.
Come together, go down to
Yeah, be
Albany,
the voice of these
be
group
the
of these
voice.
women.
Right, right. Be the voice for these women and the voice for change.
Well, after all that you've gone through, you've started this podcast, Breaking the Silence with Angeline, and you're in your
Yes,
fifth season. So you've been doing this for a while. But
I
how
know.
how how did you decide to start a podcast? Especially like 5 years ago, that had to be at the start of the podcast movement, but even before it.
Exactly. Actually, I started my podcast 2 months before COVID hit.
Ah,
Yeah, ironically, yeah, 2000, yeah. So I started it in December of 1999. It said 2020 is going to be the year, right? It's like now podcasting because yes, we are the voice for change, and I've always had a passion for empowering women to amplify their voice, to share their real life stories of how they went from lost, overwhelmed, feeling fear, and feeling broken to now thriving after domestic violence. And a lot of these women with whom I interviewed, they have become coaches, authors, spiritual counselors, whatever their passion, because they discovered their true identity. And my podcast brings that out in, with my guests. I bring that out. So, they've rediscovered themselves.
you give advice. I mean, you're there to support domestic violence
Yes,
survivors. You know, I have a sister that had several relationships, broken relationships through marriage, and I told her one time, I said, I think you need to learn to love yourself
right.
before you reach out to find another person to love you, because I think you're at a point where you don't love yourself. And I think domestic violence survivors have to go through a period where they don't love themselves. So how do they get to the point where they love themselves again?
Okay, that comes from within. And actually, I hired a mentor, and my mentor he said, love yourself. You have to love yourself first because when you love yourself and heal, that's one of the healing mechanisms. That's
Mhm.
one of the healing techniques that I teach in my coaching program through my podcasting. So, loving yourself, meaning that you love yourself of who you are
Who you are.
and take yourself like what I was doing. I was, taking myself out to dinner, going for a walk in the park, going to a movie, going to the theater, meaning loving on me. I took care of me. Like today is Wellness Wednesday for me. So I take care of me.
Mhm.
And I went to my chiropractor and, I basically took a recharge. It's a reset today for me. Doing that because first of all, you cannot pour from an empty cup. And
Yeah.
if you are not completely healed from that broken relationship, that toxic relationship, there is no way that you can pursue another relationship. And a lot of women who I know make this mistake. They go after whoever,
Oh.
like a guy on social media. They come on, and meanwhile they hate themselves.
Mm,
They haven't completely healed from the trauma. So, in other words, if you don't completely heal from the trauma and not being able to love yourself, there's no way you can be in another relationship. First, you have to focus on you.
yeah.
Love yourself. Take yourself out.
One of the lessons I learned in marriage is, sometimes I get really mad at my wife. And when I get
Mhm.
really, really mad, I make myself stop and do something nice for
There you
her.
go. There you
And
go.
so I think there's a lot of healing or getting over being angry by doing something nice. And for somebody, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It's where
No.
you're thinking of someone else's needs instead of yours. And it could be someone at work. It could be anything. It could be just someone at church. And I really kind of liked that. I mean, that's kind of stuck with me. Now, of course, the first time I did it, I washed her car and I intentionally did not take off my wedding ring. And so God got onto me while I washed her car and I lost my wedding band. And so
Uh-oh.
then I had to disclose that I lost her my wedding ring while washing her car. And so,
Ouch, okay.
but I just have always stuck, I mean, I think sometimes this generation thinks, "Oh, we have to help everybody else over ourselves," and I don't
No,
think that's a healthy way of doing it. You have to be self-sufficient to be able to help people, and I think reaching out to help others is a good way, even if it's
exactly.
working at a, soup kitchen or something, just doing something where you're not thinking of yourself or your troubles, but, I mean, if you were to kind of think about, your 5 seasons on your podcast and all your experience, what would be some of the top advice you would give somebody that is uh, saying, I'm in a toxic relationship and I need to get out?
The first thing is to take ownership and surrender, recognizing the fact that you are in a toxic relationship. And that's what I realized. That's what I came to learn, that I was in a toxic marriage. And yes, it's scary to surrender, but guess what? Once you do that, then the whole world opens up. Once you, and I call it, stop playing the victim. Okay, because there's only so long that you can play the victim and be in survival mode. It's time to take massive action. So, number one is recognizing that. And number two is starting to love on yourself. I am worthy, because women, especially domestic violence survivors, have been conditioned to believe that they are not
Mhm.
worthy. And that is huge because they've been beaten down to the ground emotionally. Emotional abuse is worse than physical abuse,
Mm.
believe it or not, because they play with your mind and they do all these things. They put you down. I mean, he what he did, he wrote letters to the New York State Police admonishing me, and the sheriff's office, and they caught on to it, and they came to me and told me what happened. And I said, that's it. I said, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. But I said, I need your help. I need your support right now, because now I'm working on an exit plan to leave, to move out. And so, so I had to surrender, and that's it. And then I went online after, I had a mentoring session with my mentor, and I am grateful for him to this day, because he said, Angeline, you have not shared your story with the world yet. I said, I know. I said, people had an idea, like my close friends and everything, but it was in March of 2018. I was in my one bedroom apartment, and I decided that I was going to share my story and be very real, raw, and vulnerable. And 7 million views later.
Wow.
And I was live for 18 minutes. I was live for 20 minutes. And after that live was over, it went viral.
Wow.
But people are scrolling, and there was no TikTok at the
Yeah.
time.
Hmm.
So people were scrolling on Facebook. A lot of women and men too, a lot of them are looking for hope. And
Sure.
that's what inspired me to start my podcast. Because I have a story to share, and there's a lot of women out there who, want my help. I mean, I'm blazing the trail for these women, that they can reclaim their life and regain their power after domestic violence. And it's going to be work. Like, you have to be willing to do the work, meaning I did a lot of inner work, shadow
Sure.
work.
Sure to work. I've talked to other groups that do what you
Mhm.
do, and it's a lot of, you need an exit plan. I will be part of your exit plan. I will meet you on this corner with your bags, and I will take you
That's
to,
right.
and you will disappear.
That's right.
We need more. I mean, we need more involvement from the government in helping these situations, not ignoring it, not sweeping it
Right.
under the carpet, not protecting or favoring the abuser over the victim, which is really what we have right now. We have a system that favors, even though we have the constitutional right in Texas to detain them, we're
Mhm.
not taking advantage of it because it's a misdemeanor and because we know that under the current system, the victim is going to disappear. And so ultimately the case will probably be dismissed or there's a
Exactly.
higher chance. Well,
Exactly.
Angeline, if somebody wanted more information about you or your podcast, how would they?
They would go to my website, which is letsbreakthesilence.com, www.letsbreakthesilence.com. And my podcast is on Spotify, Apple, and Google, and on my YouTube channel at Let's Break the Silence with Angeline. So that's how people can reach me. And also, they can email me, which is everything is on my website, but just
Okay.
to make things easier, Angeline at letsbreakthesilence.com. And I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn and TikTok. So I'm all over YouTube.
Well, but you're all over so that people can reach you, so that you can help
Right,
them and answer
exactly. We're
questions that
breaking
they
the
have.
silence. We need to break the silence and break this stigma because the courts are not doing enough to be these criminals. Oh, makes me sad to see someone being released early.
Well, I
And
mean, this is the perfect example. The government
yeah,
always thinks we can solve a situation with a new government program. Here's a situation where the government really is doing nothing, and we have almost like one of those old railroad systems where we were getting people out of slavery. We're doing that. We're getting people out of domestic violence, and it's
exactly.
all volunteers, and it's very little government involvement, and we need to fix that.
Exactly. We do need to fix that. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so
Absolutely.
much for bringing this a spotlight on these issues and talking about all the great work you're doing.
Thank
I
you.
I just think that this is an area where I think we need to put more spotlights on here, and we need to highlight these, and we need to be working on these issues to bring this information to the legislature. Because once you come and talk, I just can't see the legislature change. I mean, not agreeing that we have to do something.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Well,
We need
thank
to
you so
let's speak
much.
up and let's be the voice for change.
Well, thank you so much, Angeline. Thank you so much for coming,
You're
and I
welcome.
look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Yes, and same here, Ken. Thank you so much for having me on your
Thank you
show.
for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bell Post.